Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Who's the most famous person born in your hometown? Well, if you were born in the very rural town of Sterling, Connecticut, it borders Rhode Island, the answer is certainly Charles Dow, as in the Dow Jones Company, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the Wall Street Journal. Yes, he created all of them. Well, here to tell us why this was somewhat improbable given the very limited opportunities for education and career advancement available to Charles in the town of Sterling is the president of the Sterling Historical Society as well as the town historian of Sterling, Megan McGorry Gleason. She's going to be along in just a moment to help explain how this Wall Street giant managed to do what he did coming from Sterling. This week's trivia question: it was the first oval car racing track that actually was paved with asphalt in the entire country. Which of Connecticut's racetracks was it? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Every time you hear a business report, you know how Wall Street did on any particular day, you always hear the announcer say, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up or down or whatever it did that day. Well, the man who created the Dow Jones Industrial Average was Charles Dow. Now, he was a man from the exceptionally rural eastern Connecticut town of Sterling. Just how rural? Sterling is home to 3,500 people. Now, I can guarantee you after driving through there, you would agree that there are more ears of corn growing on Sterling's gorgeous farms than there are people. Nothing to see for miles except gorgeous vistas, and frankly, not a lot happens there. And yet, out of this setting rose one of the most important persons who ever stepped foot on Wall Street in New York City. Well, Charles Dow was born in 1851, before the Civil War, to a family that had a very large farm on Route 49 in Sterling. Now, Route 49 is one of those dedicated scenic roads in Connecticut, and those fabulously stunning views that make it fun to live in the state because you have a bunch of these roads around. Well, there was in those days a couple of industries in Sterling because the Industrial Revolution had been underway, and a couple set up shop in Sterling. And young Charles could have tried to work there, but he wanted to get out of the town. He had some higher aspirations, but he didn't really have a lot of options for advanced education. But he was extremely entrepreneurial. He wanted to leave Sterling, take on new challenges, and finally decided that the way to do it was to become a journalist, and that's exactly what he did. Now, he went first to Springfield, Massachusetts, worked in the journalism field there as a reporter, and then moved back home closer to Sterling, but he was in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, in Providence, he got the assignment of a lifetime. He was chosen to cover a story out in Colorado. You see, silver mining was starting to take off in Colorado, and a train full of movers and shakers was heading out to assess the opportunity for investment purposes, and Charles Dow's editor chose him to cover that story. Now, on the train were the president of the New York Stock Exchange, a few prominent bankers, some tycoon investors with tons of money, mining engineers, and others who saw an opportunity in silver mining. It was a 4-day train ride to Colorado, and during that ride, Charles won the confidence of the men on board, and he learned one very important lesson from them. He learned what they really wanted was access to unfettered information about factual conditions on which they could make investment decisions. Well, Charles wrote a series of very well-received dispatches during this trip, and he would end up parlaying his relatively simple lesson learned on that train into a future that created some of the most important tenets of Wall Street, which exist to this very day. Well, after that Colorado trip, Charles went back to Providence for a short bit and then went to New York City. And there, he worked for a news service, and he quickly learned that many so-called financial reporters were actually accepting gifts to write flattering stories about particular businesses so that people would make investments in those businesses, and the owners of those businesses, well, they would prosper. And those reporters, well, they got shares of stock or tips on other upcoming business trades in return for those glowing pieces. Well, it turns out, though, the investors on Wall Street really wanted was that unbiased, accurate information. Charles Dow knew this, and he knew that what they really wanted was to know the true value of companies and the actual activities that companies had underway. And so he decided to head out and start his own news service. And he brought with him a fellow who he had met for the first time as a reporter in Providence, and they just happened to end up together in New York. His name, Edward Jones. Well, the business they formed was the Dow Jones Company, and their newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, the first issue published in 1885. Now, back to Sterling, Connecticut. What were the conditions like in Sterling that Charles Dow faced and managed to escape in order to make his fame and imprint in New York City? Well, here with that part of the story is Megan McGorry Gleason. She's the town historian in Sterling and the president of the Sterling Historical Society. So, Megan, let's start off with Sterling, Connecticut in the 1850s. Just driving through town for the first time as I did today, I've got to assume that it looked not too dissimilar from how it looks now. I mean, there's miles and miles of beautiful farmland and cornfields, and you've got great vistas and views. I'm assuming 1850s, this is kind of what Charles Dow was born into as well.
I would say this town hasn't really changed at all since the 1850s, except that we've lost industry. In the 1850s, we had more industry than we do today. A manufacturing company at the center of town, which dealt with the bleaching and dyeing of fabrics, and that was the Sterling Manufacturing Company. They also sponsored the arrival of a railroad in 1853, and that was part of the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill Railroad. We also had a quarrying operation for granite, and that was just starting to take off in the 1850s and 1860s. Other than that, we were mostly a farming town, dairy farming, and most people in town were farmers if they didn't work at any of the mills or in the quarry.
Now, Charles Dow, and it's interesting you talk about the railroad coming in 1853, because here he's a youngster, 2-3 years old, and the train comes to town. Every kid loves a train, right? This will come in and play a big factor in his life later on. What do we know, if anything, about his association with the railroad? Did he ever spend any time on the railroad that we know of, or was he pretty much on the farm helping out?
I think he was on the farm helping out. His farm was about 5 or 6 miles from the railroad itself, so he may not have gotten down to that part of town all that often. At that point in time, he lived in this little place, which currently is known as Econk. Back then, it was known as Colomer. There was a little village there that pretty much had everything that the Dow family could have wanted. They had a church, they had a school, a one-room schoolhouse that was built in 1856. Everything was centered in these houses there. Their post office was in one of the houses. In fact, it may have even been inside the Dow homestead. It certainly was at one point in time, because that building is still standing today and the old postal counter is still inside the house.
Now, when you talk about the one-room schoolhouse, this triggers the discussion about what kind of education this brilliant guy, Charles Dow, came away with. And the only reading I've done on it, and this is why I'm talking to you, the expert, the only reading I've done on it is that Charles Dow really didn't get much of an education before he left town. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I don't know what a K-8 education would have looked like in the 1850s, but that schoolhouse opened when he was 5. It's possible that his only classmates were his 2 brothers. Well, actually, one of his brothers died very, very young, and the other brother didn't make it to adulthood. So he would have had his sibling in classes with him. He would have had any other area children from the surrounding farmhouses. Probably not much more than 10 or 15 kids of all ages from 5 all the way to 14.
There's an interesting aspect to his lineage, though. His family were the founders of the town, and there was a social library involved with this?
That's right. So Sterling and Voluntown were originally one town. Voluntown was originally incorporated in 1721. The length of Voluntown, which was about 5 miles wide and 20 miles long, was just prohibitive to any business, any undertakings, any social anything in this town. So the town was begging to be split apart. The Dow family was instrumental in getting the new town, Sterling, up and running. They had some money, They were more successful. They certainly had better land. Part of the problem with Sterling and Voluntown splitting apart was that Voluntown didn't have very good land for farming. Sterling had better land for farming. And the Dow family certainly had a large amount of land. They had probably about 100 acres, give or take, maybe 150 acres for farming right at the top of Route 49. That's very fertile. In fact, the Dow family farm today is the Milotich farm, which has been an operational farm for the past 101 years. So they had that. They had some means. They certainly weren't destitute. Ebenezer Dow, which is Charles Dow's great-grandfather, had a sizable estate when he passed away, and he had shares in what was known as a social library, which back in the 1790s when Sterling was formed, a social library was a library by subscription. We didn't have public libraries as they exist today. So if you wanted to go check out books, you had to have a subscription to that library that you paid for with shares in that library. And his great-grandfather had shares in the library listed in his probate, I believe in 1799. And the shares of that library were passed to his son Asa, which is Charles Dow's grandfather.
So here he is in Sterling, realizing that he's got to make a decision in his life. And he's decided now he's not going to do farming. He's going to do journalism instead. And he works for some newspapers in the area. Springfield, Massachusetts was one. And Providence in Rhode Island was a really important stop for him. And he gets this great assignment. He goes out to Colorado, as I talked about in the introduction, and covers these tycoons and whatnot, and importantly learns what it's important to report about for Wall Street tycoons. This is the kind of information they want. So he took all of this, goes to New York City, and then he's working there also in the news business. Tell us what we know about that chapter in his life.
So his Colorado reports were known as Leadville Letters. They are a huge insight into that era's history. The last letter is datelined in New York. He came down to Wall Street and he sought employment as a reporter on mining stocks. So that stock market brain had really taken hold. This is a great description of him. This was written by the Dow Jones Company when they put a memorial at his homestead where he grew up back in 1987. But this description of him is fantastic. It says, Mr. Dow quickly gained a reputation of being a reticent but reliable reporter who took shorthand notes on his cuffs and had the ability to turn routine financial reporting into expert financial analysis. And I just have this image of him with ink-stained cuffs. Can you imagine what a mess that must have looked like?
So let's talk about this for a second. He forms the Dow Jones Company. He's going to create the Wall Street Journal, and along the way, he creates the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And it starts off as something other than the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It starts off as a stock index, and the 11 companies he picked for stocks, this is where it goes back to his childhood here in Sterling, was 9 of those 11 companies were railroads. One was a shipping company, which was not unheard of here in Connecticut. And the last one was Western Union. So this is now transporting the country, bringing it together faster, communicating faster. When you think about this beginning, does that surprise you that he picked those kinds of stocks?
Not at all. When you can see what kind of impact that the railroad had just on this small, primarily farming and slightly industrial community, and now all of a sudden it's more industrial than farming, and you have these quarries opening, transporting huge blocks of granite all over eastern Connecticut and off to Providence, and it's opened up these lines of communication. It's opened up these avenues of commerce with Providence that this town sort of had established, but it wasn't really, there's only so much you can do by horse and buggy. So now in 1853, we have it all coming home, and it's, you have trains running daily. You have people being able to travel far and wide. I mean, he never would have gotten out of Sterling to go to Springfield if the railroad wasn't here.
When you think back to his Wall Street Journal days and the motto that he put together and his whole sort of spirit of being fair and honest and accurate and not taking bribes to push certain companies, which was routine in New York City in the day. Does that surprise you?
Coming from this town, no. I think based on values that he would have learned here and kind of just being down to earth and not having a lot of monetary influence and not a lot of corruption in those days. That doesn't surprise me at all. This town is kind of still that way. We're a very basic town. We serve our citizens and we don't have a lot of pomp and circumstance or a lot of fanfare. We don't really have corruption. There's no money to corrupt.
So when you think of Charles Dow and you drive by his homestead on Route 49, does that ever seem like there's a disconnect? I mean, you're on a scenic road. First of all, Route 49 is one of the designated scenic roads in the state of Connecticut. It's gorgeous to drive down. There's, more corn than anything else on the road. And then you're driving by and you see this house and right in front this plaque to Charles Dow. Does it ever seem like a misnomer to you that out of this rural, gorgeous area came Charles Dow?
Something that has influenced the world economy in ways that can't be measured. Yeah, there is a massive disconnect. It doesn't really register. It doesn't hit home that we had that kind of a brain come out of this town. Because often most people don't know that this town even exists. And for him to go out to Colorado and find a passion for something and be able to develop that passion into the Dow Jones Industrial Index and have an actual theory, a financial theory named after him, the Dow theory, that blows my mind because people like that seem to come from cities. They seem to come from old money. And he didn't really have any of that. Maybe something in old money, whatever that would have meant in the 1850s. I would say his family certainly was well off, comfortable, but not wealthy beyond any imagination. I would say, if you had to compare them to any class of people nowadays, upper middle class for sure. But we wouldn't expect to see somebody like that come out of this farming town.
Would you say, if you had to guess, that most people in Sterling know who Charles Dow was and they're proud of him, or would you say that it's kind of a secret?
I would say it's more of a surprise when they find out. I don't think they quite realize how much influence that he had. When people ask who is the most famous person to come out of this town, certainly it's Charles Dow. Other people will argue that maybe it's the invention of fast black dye. Those are the two things that we're known for. But Charles Dow is more famous. I mean, you couldn't really name the person who invented the fast black dye other than people who live in this town. But you know who Charles Dow is if you look into the history of the Dow Jones.
Are you as sort of gobsmacked as I am that Charles Dow is not buried in this town?
No, I'm not. I think that's just because I know he spent a majority of his adult life away from town. But his mother still lived here at the time that Charles Dow passed away, because he passed away young and his mother outlived him. She's buried here, his father is buried here, and his ancestors are buried here. But the fact that he's not doesn't surprise me at all. It almost seems like the city of Providence sort of, I don't know if they adopted him or what, but he is buried in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, which is sort of the who's who of Rhode Island, the who's who of Providence, the who's who of social life at that time. And it's a very gorgeous cemetery. So I'm not surprised he's buried in a place like that.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. If you pass by Charles Dow's house on Route 49 in Sterling, you'll certainly know it's his because there's a monument in the front yard dedicated to him. It was placed there by the Dow Jones Company at a ceremony back in 1987. Trust me, it's a beautiful drive that'll take you to a part of Connecticut that you absolutely should not miss. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Megan McGorry Gleason. She is president of the Sterling Historical Society, and she's the town historian of Sterling. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it was the first oval car racing track in this country that was actually paved with asphalt. Which of Connecticut's 4 racetracks was it? It was the Thompson Speedway in Northeast Connecticut, and that asphalt track opened back in 1940. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to speak with one of the key members of this family-owned operation. They've run it for generations. He's going to talk about the many firsts accomplished at Thompson Speedway, including a surprise piece of fascinating information that you are not going to want to miss. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.